The yard behind the Red Lantern Saloon lay under a dome of lamplight that turned the packed earth the color of old rust and the watching men into a theater of shadows. Their boots drummed against the balcony railings above, creating a rhythm like distant war drums. Rifles rested easy across forearms, barrels glinting dull and menacing in the flickering glow. Voices murmured low and expectant in the way men sound when they smell blood coming and are not certain whose it will be, but are eager to find out. In the center of that ring sat Rose Keller, 24 years old, her face the color of candle wax. Mud streaked her cheeks in long, dirty trails. Her dress, once a faded calico and the shade of weak tea, hung torn at the shoulder, the fabric bunched awkwardly around her hips, where she had tried desperately to preserve some shred of modesty. Both legs stretched out in front of her at angles no human limb should make. The leather of her work boots bulged tight over swollen flesh, the seams straining. Dark stains seeped through the stitching where shattered bone had pressed too hard from the inside, and the smell of blood hung thick in the still air. She had stopped screaming an hour ago. The screaming had torn her throat raw, left her voice a broken whisper. Now she sat silent, her breath coming in shallow gasps that barely moved her chest. Her hands clutched handfuls of dirt, knuckles white as bone, as if the earth itself could anchor her against the waves of pain that threatened to drag her under into unconsciousness. A man knelt in front of her. He was Lakota, broad through the shoulders, lean everywhere else, his face all sharp planes and hard angles carved by sun and loss and years of living between two worlds that wanted no part of him. He wore buckskin trousers, dark with trail dust, and a plain cotton shirt open at the throat and the fabric stained with sweat and dirt. A single eagle feather hung from a leather thong around his neck, the shaft dyed red in the old way. The war bonnet, the one that had made the saloon go silent 3 days earlier when he had walked through those doors, rested across his saddle 20 paces away, where his paint horse stood with ears flat against its skull, sensing the violence coiled in the air like a snake preparing to strike. His name was Lakota. Most white men in Powder Keg called him nothing at all, or else Lone Wolf, when they wanted to sound like they knew something about Indians. He did not correct them. Words were cheap as dirt. Names were sacred, and these men understood nothing of the sacred. Rose looked up at him. Her lips moved, cracked and bleeding. The sound that came out was thin and reedy, but it carried in the stillness the way a nail carries when it scrapes slowly across glass. "They broke my legs," she said, loud enough for every man on that porch to hear her voice, trembling but clear, "for serving you." The murmurs stopped, as if someone had drawn a knife across a taut rope. The night pressed in hot and thick, despite the late hours smelling of horse manure and spilled whiskey and the iron tang of blood drying slowly in dust. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, once then fell silent. Deputy Horatio Miles stood near the saloon's back steps, a double-barreled shotgun cradled in the crook of his arm like a sleeping child. He was a tall man, thin as a fence post, with a nose that had been broken twice and set poorly both times, giving his face a perpetual sneer. The star on his vest was tarnished, the metal dull. The grin on his face was not. "Move away from her, Indian." Miles called out his voice, carrying the lazy drawl of a man who has said the same thing 100 times and expects to be obeyed every single time. "This here is white folks' business. Ain't got nothing to do with you." Lakota did not move. He shifted his weight just enough so that his broad shoulders came between Rose and the crowd. The torn edge of her skirt fluttered in the faint evening breeze, threatening to slide higher and expose more than any woman should be forced to reveal in front of a mob of liquored-up men. He adjusted his position again, turning slightly, using his body as a living curtain. His back blocked the men's view of her bare shin and the obscene angle of her knee, the way the bone pressed against skin from the inside. It was not a grand gesture. It was practical, immediate, the kind of protection that required no words. But Rose's breath hitched. She understood what he was doing. Shame and gratitude twisted together in her chest, sharp enough to draw fresh tears that cut clean tracks through the dust on her cheeks. Miles took a step forward, his boot heels striking the wooden step with a deliberate thud. The shotgun's twin muzzles caught the lamplight, dark and hungry. "I said move," he repeated slower this time, each word deliberate as a hammer strike against an anvil. "Or we'll move you permanent, and I don't reckon you want that." Odakota's voice, when it came, was quiet. It did not need to be loud. "She needs a doctor," he said, his English carrying only the faintest trace of accent. "Not a rope, not a mob, a doctor." A ripple went through the crowd, like wind through tall grass. Some men leaned forward, eager for violence, and their faces flushed with whiskey and the promise of bloodshed. Others glanced uneasily toward the edge of town, where a cluster of Lakota riders sat their horses in the darkness, just beyond the last lantern's glow, watching and waiting like wolves, at the edge of firelight, their presence a silent threat. Barbed wire, Bill Barrow stepped out of the saloon's back door, the hinges creaking under his weight. He was a thick man, barrel-chested and solid, with a beard the color of rust and eyes like chips of flint. He owned the Red Lantern. He owned most of the silver claims along Cold Creek. He owned the only reliable well for 10 miles in any direction, and he charged for every single bucket drawn from it. His word was not quite law in Powder Keg, but it was close enough that the difference did not matter to anyone who wanted to keep breathing. He looked at Rose, then at Odakota, then at the shotgun in Miles's hands. His mouth curled into something that might have been a smile if it had reached his eyes. It did not. "Bring her inside," Bill said, his voice carrying the flat certainty of a man accustomed to obedience. "We'll sort this proper." Miles started forward, his boots scraping against the dirt. Odakota did not move. His hand resting on his knee was inches from the knife on his belt, a good blade, 10 inches of steel, traded from a cavalryman who needed whiskey more than he needed a weapon. The crowd knew it. Miles knew it. Bill knew it. The moment stretched thin as wire taut and trembling, ready to snap. Then a new voice cut through the tension like a blade through cloth. "If she dies out here," said Dr. Abraham Keller, pushing through the crowd with a leather satchel clutched in his gnarled hands, "every eye in Powder Keg will remember who kept me from treating her." He paused, letting the words sink in like stones dropped into still water. "You're greedy, Bill, but you ain't stupid. Not yet, anyway." Bill's jaw worked, the muscles bunching under his beard. He glanced at Miles, then at the crowd, then back at Abraham. The calculation was visible on his face, plain as daylight. A dead woman in the yard meant questions. Questions meant attention. Attention from territorial authorities or federal marshals was bad for business. Finally, slowly he nodded. Miles lowered the shotgun, the barrels pointing at the ground. Odakota carefully lifted Rose one arm, sliding under her shoulders, the other supporting her knees, with a gentleness that belied his strength. She gasped, biting down on a cry that wanted to tear free from her throat. He adjusted his grip so that the torn fabric of her skirt stayed in place, turning slightly, so the crowd saw as little as possible. Her face was inches from his. She tried to meet his eyes, and could not shame washing over her in waves, not because of what had been done to her, but because she needed this stranger's strength just to move, just to exist in this moment. "Look at me," he said quietly, too low for anyone else to hear, his voice steady as bedrock. "Not them." She did. For a heartbeat, the crowd and the lamps and the pain fell away. There was only his face, calm and intent, and the steady rhythm of his breathing. He carried her toward the clinic without another word, his moccasins making no sound on the packed earth. Powder Keg was not a town, not in any real sense. It was an argument built of clapboard and canvas, squatting in the high plains where the Lakota hunting grounds bled into the silver-rich gullies along Cold Creek. It was a collection of buildings and tents, held together by greed and violence, and the faint, desperate hope that tomorrow might bring a strike big enough to justify today's suffering. The streets were mud in spring dust and summer-frozen ruts in winter. No church had been built yet, though there was talk of one. 3 saloons operated full-time. Justice, such as it was, came from whoever had the most guns and the least conscience. In the summer of 1858, the territory was a patchwork of overlapping claims, each one disputed federal land grants, railroad right-of-ways, treaty boundaries that shifted every time Washington needed more room for settlers or cattle, or the iron rails that would bind the nation together in steel. The Lakota had hunted these hills since before any white man had drawn maps or planted flags. The miners had been here 3 years, digging their holes and staking their claims. Both sides believed the land was theirs by right. Both sides were armed. Neither was inclined to compromise. Barbed Wire Bill Barrow understood this better than most. He had arrived in Powder Keg in the spring of 1855, before the first tent went up, before the first claim was registered, staking ground that somehow always turned out to sit on the richest veins of silver. His riders patrolled the prairie with breech-loading Sharps carbines slung across their saddles, the weapons worth more than most men earned in a year. His freight wagons rolled in from Goldwater every 2 weeks, with crates marked hardware that clinked like bottles and rattled like ammunition. He did not run the town, not officially, but he held the leash tight enough that the difference barely mattered to anyone paying attention. The Red Lantern was his crown jewel. 2 stories of rough-cut pine, a bar polished smooth by 10,000 elbows, a stage where women danced badly and sang worse, and rooms upstairs where transactions were conducted that no ledger ever recorded. Bill kept an office on the 2nd floor with a roll-top desk imported from St. Louis, a Chubb lock ordered from Boston, and an account book he guarded more carefully than his Colt Navy revolver. Rose Keller had worked at the Red Lantern for 8 months. She had come west in the autumn of 1857 on promises of domestic work, cooking, cleaning, sewing for respectable families who needed help managing frontier households. The promises had evaporated somewhere between Pennsylvania and the Missouri River, dissolved in a fog of half-truths and outright lies. By the time she reached Powder Keg in late October, her savings were gone, her prospects were few, and her choices were fewer. Bill had offered her a job hauling whiskey and scrubbing floors. She had taken it because the alternative was starving in a strange land where no one spoke her language and no one cared whether she lived or died. She was not like the other women who worked upstairs. She was too plain, too quiet, too quick to flinch when men's voices rose or hands reached out. But she was good with numbers. Her father had taught her arithmetic before the fever took him when she was 12. And she kept her mouth shut, and Bill trusted her to clean near his desk while he counted coins and muttered over columns of figures that never quite added up the way they should. She had learned to move quietly, to keep her eyes down, to notice things without seeming to notice. She had noticed, for instance, that the names in Bill's account book matched the men who rode out before the so-called Indian raids that left cabins burned and families missing. She had noticed that miners who complained too loudly about crooked scales on the ore wagons tended to have accidents in the shafts shortly after cave-ins or falling timbers that crushed them into silence. She had noticed the regular payments from something called the Transcontinental Spur Company, always in round numbers, always marked with cryptic notes like clearing fee or obstruction removed or claim vacated. She had said nothing. Words got women hurt. Silence kept them breathing. She had learned that lesson young and learned it well. Until 3 days ago, June 14th, 1858 to be exact, when a Lakota warrior had walked into the Red Lantern in broad daylight and she had put a cup of coffee in front of him instead of turning him away. Lakota had been born in a valley 20 miles north of Powder Keg, in a place where the cold creek split around a stand of ancient cottonwoods, and the grass grew tall enough to hide a deer. He was 31 years old now. Though he looked older, the kind of aging that comes from loss rather than years from grief, that settles into your bones and never quite leaves. His wife Winona had planted corn in that valley the old way, with prayers to the earth. His daughter, whose name he no longer spoke aloud, because speaking it made her death too real, had learned to walk there. Her small hands clutching his fingers as she tottered between the lodge poles laughing. Both were buried there now, under stones. He had piled himself with hands that shook so badly he could barely lift them the morning after the soldiers left. The state volunteers had come through in January of 1855, a clearing action authorized by the territorial governor to open grazing land for cattlemen who had paid handsomely for access. The officer's report, filed in triplicate and stamped with an official seal, called it an unfortunate clash with hostiles resisting lawful settlement. Lakota remembered the smell of burning buffalo hides and lodge poles, the acrid smoke that choked the valley. He remembered the sound of his daughter's voice, high and terrified, calling for him, cut short by the sharp crack of a rifle shot. He had tracked the volunteers for 3 days, moving through snow and darkness, living on rage and the promise of revenge. His uncle Old Crow had pulled him back on the 4th day, physically dragging him away from the soldiers' camp. "You kill one." Old Crow had set a weathered face, hard as stone, his grip like iron on Lakota's arm. "They killed 10 of us. You want revenge, you outlive them. You make them see what they did. You make them remember. You make them pay in ways that matter." Lakota had not found peace in that advice, but he had found purpose. He learned English from a missionary who drank too much and talked too freely about the workings of white men's minds. He learned how white men thought by watching them cheat each other at cards and lie to their own officers about supplies and distances. He learned how to move between worlds without belonging to either a ghost in 2 lands, trusted by neither, useful to both. Now he worked as a scout and interpreter for a small army detachment stationed 5 miles east of Powder Keg. The soldiers did not trust him. Indians were Indians, no matter whose side they claimed to be on. The Lakota did not forgive him for working with the Blue Coats, for guiding them through territory that should have remained hidden. But he was useful, and usefulness was a kind of survival, a way to stay alive long enough to see justice done, if justice could ever be found in a land that valued land more than lives. 3 days ago, on June 14th, he had come to the Red Lantern to meet an Army sergeant named Howell about new survey stakes driven deep into Lakota hunting ground stakes that marked boundaries no treaty had ever drawn, lines that existed only in the minds of men who sat in offices far away and drew maps of land they had never seen. The saloon had gone silent when he walked in, the kind of silence that precedes violence. Hands had drifted toward gun belts. Eyes had followed him like wolves, tracking a wounded elk, waiting to see if he would stumble, if he would give them an excuse. Rose had crossed the floor with a tin mug of coffee, her steps quick and nervous. She had set it down without letting her hands shake, though he could see the fear in her eyes and the way her pupils dilated. "Sergeant's late," she had said quietly, her voice barely carrying over the sudden hush. "You shouldn't be here long. Please." Lakota had studied her face, pale, freckled, exhausted, in a way that went deeper than lack of sleep, and the kind of exhaustion that came from months or years of fear, and seen something he recognized. Fear, yes, but also the kind of stubborn defiance that came from surviving things that should have killed you, and deciding that surviving was not enough anymore, that there had to be something more than just drawing the next breath. "I need information," he had said, keeping his voice low, barely above a whisper. "My people talk about wagons near the Cold Creek shafts, blasting powder being moved at night, stakes going up where no stakes should be." Rose's eyes had flicked toward the stairs that led to Bill's office, then back to him. For a moment, she had looked like she might say nothing, might turn and walk away. Then she had leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that he had to strain to hear. "He's been paying riders on days the mine accidents happen." She had said the words coming fast and low. "I clean near the safe. I see the numbers in his book when he leaves it open. Same names appear, same dates. Men disappear after, and the railroad pays him for it. $300 a claim, sometimes more. He pockets most of it." Before Lakota could ask more, Bill had appeared at the top of the stairs, his heavy footsteps announcing his approach. His fingers had clamped around Rose's arm like a vice, hard enough to leave bruises that would bloom purple by morning. "You talk too soft around painted savages." He had growled, jerking her back hard enough to make her stumble and nearly fall. Lakota had risen from his chair, his hand dropping to his knife. Horatio Miles had stepped between them, shotgun low, but ready, the twin barrels steady. "Sit down, lone wolf." Miles had set his voice friendly, in the way a snake is friendly before it strikes all false warmth and hidden venom. "Or ride out. Your choice. Make it quick." Lakota had measured the room, too many guns, too few allies, Rose's terrified face telling him to leave before it got worse, and chosen to walk. Survival meant knowing when to fight and when to retreat. But as he rode out on his paint horse, he had seen 3 wagons loaded with barrels marked blasting powder, rolling east toward Cold Creek, guarded by 6 of Bill's men, all armed with carbines. He had ridden hard to warn Old Crow that some accident was coming that would be blamed on the Lakota and used as excuse for reprisals for driving them off the last good hunting ground they had left. That evening, June 14th, just as the sun was setting in a blaze of red and gold, soldiers had arrived at the Lakota camp with an order signed by the post commander. Lakota must return to town immediately and answer charges of incitement to riot and conspiracy to disturb the peace at the saloon. He had gone wary, but unwilling to give them an excuse to raid the camp and hang the first man they found, which was how these things usually went. He had arrived on the evening of June 15th to find the yard scene already in progress. Rose crippled in the dust, the crowd gathered like vultures circling a dying animal. Bill and Miles standing over her like hunters who had made their kill and were now deciding how to divide the spoils. When Rose had confessed that they broke her legs for serving him and speaking to him, the murmur had turned ugly fast, a rolling wave of anger and fear looking for a target. Dr. Abraham Keller was 62 years old with hands that shook unless he was working and a scar across his throat from a Confederate bayonet that had come within an inch of severing his windpipe at Shiloh. He had been a good surgeon, once the kind the Army valued, and promoted the kind who could cut off a limb in under 2 minutes and save 3 men out of 5. Then his son Thomas had come west in the spring of 1857 to work Bill's mines, lured by promises of good wages and a chance to build something in a new land. 6 months later, November 7th, 1857, to be exact, a date Abraham had carved into his memory like a tombstone inscription, Thomas had been buried under a ton of rock in a collapse that the foreman called an act of providence, and the company report called unavoidable tragedy due to unstable geology. Abraham had looked at the timbers after they pulled his son's broken body from the rubble, rotten, undersized, placed wrong, cut from green wood that should never have been used for load-bearing supports, and known better. He had also known that speaking up would get him run out of town, and then who would set bones and stitch wounds for the men too poor to afford the company doctor in Goldwater who charged $5 just to walk through the door. So he had buried his son in the Hill Cemetery, paying for a wooden marker that would rot away in 5 years, and kept his mouth shut. But he watched. He kept notes. He scratched dates and names on the backs of prescription slips and tucked them into his leather satchel, building a catalog of deaths that made no sense, unless you assumed someone was making money from them, unless you believed that men could be that evil for simple profit. Inside the clinic, a single-room shack with a rope cot, a scarred wooden table, and shelves lined with bottles whose labels had faded to illegibility. Abraham worked on Rose's legs with the grim efficiency of a man who had cut off limbs in field hospitals, while cannon fire shook the walls and made the instruments rattle on their trays. Setting the compound fractures took both his strength and Odakota's steady grip on Rose's shoulders to hold her still while the bones ground back into some semblance of their proper position. The sound was terrible, a wet grinding crunch that made even Abraham's stomach turn. Her screams carried into the night, high and terrible and utterly inhuman, the kind of sound that should not come from a human throat. Odakota's fingers left bruises on the wooden cot frame, the wood cracking under the pressure. But he never let go, never allowed her to thrash and undo Abraham's work. When it was done, Rose lay pale and trembling, her breath coming in shallow gasps that barely moved her chest. Sweat soaked her hair and dress, despite the cool night air. Abraham wrapped the splints carved from barrel staves and padded with strips of cloth torn from his own shirt and bound them tight with leather straps cut from an old harness. "She'll live," he said, wiping blood from his hands onto a rag that was already stiff with old stains. "Maybe, if infection don't set in. But she'll never walk right again, not without help, not without a cane. The bones are too shattered." Outside, Miles stirred the crowd that had not yet dispersed men who lingered like carrion birds. "If she dies," he said loudly, loud enough for Odakota to hear through the open window, "we hang him. Indian justice for Indian crimes. Eye for an eye. Seems fair." Celine Broussard appeared in the doorway moments later, breathless, her dark hair falling loose from its pins and streaming down her back. She was 26, the schoolteacher, sharp-eyed and sharp-minded, the daughter of a New Orleans accountant who had sent her west to teach and build character after she had embarrassed the family by speaking too freely about abolition at a dinner party. She had built character. She had also built a spine of iron and a will that bent for no man. She pushed past the lingering men on the porch, ignoring their muttered comments about uppity women, and stepped into the clinic. "How is she?" "Alive." Abraham said, his voice flat with exhaustion. "Barely. It's up to her now. And God, if he's paying attention." Celine set a stack of books on the table, primers and readers, things Rose could look at if she woke, if she wanted distraction from the pain. Then she turned to Odakota, her dark eyes fierce. "You need to leave town. Tonight. Right now. They're talking about a necktie party. Miles is working them up." "I'm not leaving her." Odakota said, his voice flat and final. "Then you're a fool." Celine snapped, but her eyes softened slightly, seeing something in his face that she recognized. "A brave fool. But still a fool. They will kill you." "Let them try," Odakota said. Rose survived the night of June 15th, but fever came with the dawn of June 16th, settling over her like a shroud. She drifted in and out of consciousness, her skin hot to the touch, muttering words that made little sense. Abraham wiped her forehead with a damp cloth and listened, trying to parse meaning from delirium. "Columns," she whispered, her voice hoarse and broken. "Numbers don't add up. Same names over and over, same dates. He pays them and men die, every time, every single time." "Hush now," Abraham said gently, his voice the soothing tone he had used on dying soldiers. "You need rest. Just rest." But Rose's eyes fluttered open, glassy and unfocused, staring at something only she could see. "The book," she said, her voice rising, slightly urgent. "He locks it in the desk. But I see the numbers when he's drunk. Miles gets $50. Men die. Bill gets $300 from the railroad. Every time someone dies, he gets richer. every single time. She slipped back into fever before she could say more, her words dissolving into incoherent mumbling. Abraham sat back, his pulse quickening despite his age. He thought of his son. He thought of the dates and names he had scratched onto prescription slips over the past months. He pulled the satchel toward him and began to spread the slips across the table, arranging them by date. Thomas Keller, dead in mine collapse, November 7th, 1857. John Pritchard, crushed by falling beam, January 15th, 1858. Samuel Gray, disappeared after supposed Indian raid, March 22nd, 1858. Henry Walsh, cave-in, April 9th, 1858. Abraham pulled out more slips, his hands moving faster now. The pattern emerged slowly like a shape resolving in fog. Every death matched a date when freight wagons left town heading east. Every freight wagon departure matched a payment Rose had glimpsed in the account book. The names repeated: Miles Rollins, Webb. Always the same men, always $50 each. And always a few days later, a larger payment from the railroad. His hands began to shake, but not from age this time. Celine arrived at noon on June 16th, with more books tucked under her arm and a basket of bread and cheese. "For Rose," she said, setting them on the table. "When she wakes? If she wakes." Abraham gestured to the table covered in slips of paper. "Look at this. Tell me what you see." Celine set the basket down and studied the slips, her brow furrowing in concentration. She had a gift for arithmetic, the kind of mind that saw relationships between numbers the way most people saw relationships between faces, patterns emerging where others saw only chaos. She had once balanced her father's accounts when he was too drunk to see straight, catching errors that would have cost him his business and possibly his life. "These dates," she said slowly, tracing her finger across the slips, connecting them in her mind. "I've seen them before, or ones very like them." "Where?" Abraham asked, leaning forward. "Bill asked me to help with sums once. Last February, maybe early March. He was drunk, couldn't make the columns balance properly. I remember because the figures were strange, large payments going out to individuals, even larger payments coming in from some company. He snatched the book away before I could finish, told me to mind my business. But I remember this date." She tapped one of the slips with her fingernail. March 22, a payment to someone marked just HM, $50, and right below it, a payment received marked TSC, $320. The note beside it said, "Gray claim cleared, obstruction removed." Abraham's jaw tightened, the muscles bunching. HM Horatio Miles. "And TSC must be Transcontinental Spur Company," Celine said, her voice hardening with anger. "The railroad that wants this whole territory cleared for their line." The clinic door opened with a creak of hinges. Lakota stepped inside, ducking under the low frame. He had been sitting outside all night on June 15th, his back against the wall, ignoring the glares of passing men and the muttered threats about what they would do to him if Rose died. His eyes went first to Rose, checking her breathing, then to Abraham. "She's alive," Abraham said, anticipating the question. "For now. Fever's bad, but I've seen worse." Lakota moved to the cot, his steps silent despite his size. Rose's face was flushed, her breathing shallow and rapid. He reached out, then stopped, his hand hovering over hers, unsure if touch would comfort or frighten her in her delirium. "She spoke your name," Abraham said quietly, watching him. "In the fever. Said you shouldn't have stayed. Said they'd kill you for her." Lakota's expression did not change, but something tightened in his jaw, a muscle jumping. Celine cleared her throat, drawing their attention. "We need to see that account book. The whole thing, every page. If we can prove Bill's been defrauding the railroad and killing people for profit, the federal marshal in Goldwater will have to act. It's a territorial matter, then maybe even federal. It's locked in Bill's desk, Abraham said, stating the obvious obstacle. Second floor of the Red Lantern. You'd have to break in. And if you're caught, Miles will hang you legal-like with a proper rope and everything. No, Celine said, reaching into her pocket. You'd have to have a key. She pulled out a small brass key, the metal dull in the lamplight. Bill cornered me outside the school 3 days ago. June 13th, late afternoon. Thought I was too naive to understand what he wanted, that I'd be flattered by his attention. I let him think that played the fool. And while he was pawing at my waist, I lifted this from his coat pocket. Pickpocketing was a useful skill in New Orleans, especially for a girl whose father drank away the grocery money. Lakota looked at her with new respect, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time. You've been planning this. I've been surviving this, Celine corrected sharply. There's a difference. Planning suggests I have choices. I don't. None of us do. We survive or we die. Those are the only choices in this place. She turned to Abraham, her expression fierce. Tonight, June 16th after midnight. The saloon empties out, then most of the drunks stagger home or pass out. We go in, take the book, and ride for Goldwater at first light with evidence. The marshal can't ignore hard numbers. Abraham asked, his eyebrows rising. You plan to break into Bill Barrow's office? Yes, Celine said firmly, her chin lifting in defiance. All of us who can move. Because if we don't, Rose is just the first. There will be more, and more after that. Men like Bill don't stop until someone stops them. Lakota shook his head slowly. If they catch you, if they catch any of us, then we die. Celine interrupted, her voice hard as stone. But we're dying anyway, all of us. Slowly, one piece at a time, watching him kill and steal and destroy. This way, at least, we die for something. At least we try to make it mean something. The three of them stood in silence, the weight of the decision settling over them like a burial shroud. Outside, the sounds of the town continued, horses' voices, the distant clang of a smithy's hammer. Life going on indifferent to their suffering. Finally, Lakota nodded, once sharp and decisive. Midnight then. The night of June 16th was thick and moonless, clouds rolling in from the west, with the promise of thunder that never quite arrived, just the oppressive weight of a storm held in abeyance. Powder Keg lay quiet, most of its men, either drunk in their tents or asleep in their bunks. A single lamp burned in Bill's upstairs office, a yellow square in the darkness, like a warning beacon or a lighthouse guiding ships to their destruction. Lakota and Celine climbed the back stairs of the Red Lantern with aching slowness, moving one step at a time, testing each board before committing their weight. Lakota's moccasins made no sound, and the soft leather designed for silence. Celine's shoes, tied with rags to muffle them, whispered against the wood like wind through dry grass. The key fit the lock with a soft click that sounded loud as a gunshot, and in the silence making them both freeze and hold their breath. The door swung open on hinges that needed oil, the squeal making Celine wince, and Lakota's hand dropped to his knife. Inside, the office smelled of cigar smoke and old leather, and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, like blood long dried and turned to rust. A roll-top desk sat against the far wall, its surface cluttered with papers, receipts, a half-empty bottle of whiskey, and an ivory-handled Colt Navy revolver that gleamed dully in the lamplight, beautiful and deadly. The account book lay in a shallow drawer on the right side, its cover worn smooth by handling the leather, soft as skin. Celine opened it with trembling fingers, her breath coming fast and shallow. The pages were filled with neat columns of figures, dates, names, amounts. Bill's handwriting was surprisingly elegant. Each number precisely formed a mockery of the ugliness the numbers represented. She ran her finger down the entries, her lips moving silently, as she added and subtracted in her head, years of training taking over. "This isn't random," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Look, June 10th, payment to HM and JR and TW, $50 each. June 12th, just 2 days later, payment received from TSC, $300. Note beside it, section cleared, obstruction removed. He's charging the railroad triple what he pays out." Lakota leaned over her shoulder close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, smell the leather and sage smoke that clung to his clothes. His jaw tightened as he read the muscle jumping. "What does it mean?" "It means," Celine said slowly, her voice shaking with anger and horror, "that Bill is charging the railroad to clear land of settlers and Lakota alike. Anyone in the way of their survey line. He pays thugs to kill miners or scare families off their claims. Then he pockets the difference and lists it as expenses. Every time somebody dies, he makes money. He's been doing this for years and no one noticed because who pays attention to dead miners and missing Indians?" She flipped back through the pages, her hands moving faster now, turning months and years. January 1858, November 1857, June 1857, March 1857. Every month, sometimes twice a month, the same pattern repeating like a nightmare. Payments out to the same 3 or 4 names. Larger payments in from TSC. Notes like accident arranged, and claim vacated, and obstruction eliminated, and family relocated. Then she turned to an older section, the paper yellowed with age. Her hand froze, fingers splayed across the page. The entry was dated January 15th, 1855. A large payment from the territorial government marked in Bill's careful script, Volunteer Clearing Patrol, Lakota Valley Suppression State Contract. Below it, a list of names of men who had ridden in the patrol. Among them, written in the same elegant hand, W. Barrow, H. Miles J. Rollins, T. Webb. Celine looked up at Lakota, horror dawning in her eyes, like a slow, terrible sunrise. "He was there," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Bill was there. When your people, when your family." She did not finish. She did not need to. The date was enough. Lakota stared at the page, his vision tunneling until there was nothing else, just that list of names and the date that had carved his life in half, that had turned him from a husband and father into a ghost walking between worlds. "Miles, too," he said, his voice flat and cold as a January wind over snow. "Miles was there. He killed them. He killed my wife, my daughter, for money, for a state contract." The floorboard behind them creaked a long, slow groan of old wood under weight. They both spun, Lakota's hand going to his knife, Celine sucking in a sharp breath. Horatio Miles stood in the doorway, a Colt Navy revolver in his hand, the barrel steady and level, barbed wire. Bill loomed behind him, his shirt half-buttoned over his hairy chest, his eyes cold and calculating, a predator disturbed in his den. "You just signed your own death warrants," Bill said, his voice conversational, almost friendly. "Couldn't leave well enough alone, could you? Had to go poking around in things that ain't your business." Lakota lunged forward as Miles fired. The shot was deafening in the small room, and the muzzle flash bright as lightning, leaving purple after-images dancing in their vision. The bullet smashed into the ink bottle on the desk, spraying black liquid across the open account book, like a splash of blood, the acrid smell of gunpowder filling the air and making their eyes water. Celine screamed a short, sharp sound of terror. Lakota slammed into Miles' shoulder first, driving him backward into the doorframe with enough force to crack the wood. Miles was taller, but thinner, all bone and gristle. And Lakota had spent years wrestling horses and men and surviving in a world that wanted him dead. He drove his shoulder into Miles's ribs, heard and felt the satisfying crack of bone breaking. Bill grabbed a hickory axe handle from its mount on the wall and swung hard, putting his weight behind it. Lakota ducked, but the blow caught his left shoulder, the same shoulder that still ached from old wounds and newer ones. Pain exploded down his arm, hot and sharp and blinding. The account book skidded across the floor toward the open door, pages fluttering. Celine dove for it, her hands scrabbling. Miles twisted free from Lakota's grip, raising the revolver again, his face twisted with rage and pain, blood running from his nose where it had struck the doorframe. "Damn squaw lover!" He snarled, his voice thick with hatred. "Should have killed you years ago." Celine slammed the heavy oak desk lid down onto his gun hand with all her strength. Bone crunched audibly. Miles howled an animal sound of pure agony. The revolver clattered to the floor, spinning. Blood welled up where the wood had split his knuckles open to the bone, white showing through red. Bill roared and lunged after the book, surprisingly fast for a man his size. Celine snatched it up and ran to the window, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. For a moment, she hesitated, looking at the drop to the alley below, weighing fear against necessity. Then she heard Bill's boots pounding behind her and made the only choice that mattered. She hurled the account book into the darkness below, watched it tumble and disappear into shadow. "Damn you!" Bill bellowed, his face going purple with rage, veins standing out on his forehead. "Damn you to hell!" He shoved past Miles and leaned out the window, searching the shadows, his hands gripping the sill so hard his knuckles went white. Lakota used the moment, recognizing opportunity. He grabbed Celine's arm, his grip tight but not painful. "Jump. You're insane. We'll break our necks. Jump now or hang later. Choose." He went first, trusting momentum and luck more than courage, because courage was a luxury he could not afford. He hit the lean-to roof below the boards, cracking under his weight with sounds like rifle shots, but holding barely, the nails groaning. Pain lanced through his injured shoulder, bright and vicious, stealing his breath. Celine followed half a heartbeat later, her skirt catching on a nail and tearing with a sound like ripping flesh, exposing her petticoats. They rolled off the lean-to together, hitting the alley in a tangle of limbs and fabric. Lakota's hand fell on the account book, in the dirt, half buried but intact, its leather cover slick with mud. He grabbed it, rolled to his feet despite the pain screaming in his shoulder, and pulled Celine after him with his good arm. Behind them, shouts rose in the saloon voices, raised in alarm and anger. Lamps flared to life in windows up and down the street, yellow squares blossoming in the darkness. Boots pounded on stairs, heavy and purposeful, the sound of men arming themselves and preparing to hunt. They ran, their footsteps echoing off the clapboard walls, running blind into darkness, into the unknown, into whatever came next. By dawn on June 17th, Bill had spun his story with the skill of a practiced liar. The Indian had attacked him in his sleep, he claimed, showing scratches on his forearms that might have come from anywhere. Stolen private business papers vital to his operations. Seduced the schoolteacher into helping him, probably with promises of protection or gold or whatever savages promised white women. Miles, nursing his broken hand, wrapped in bloody bandages, and his bruised ribs, claimed Celine had lured him upstairs to distract him, while her savage lover robbed the office, played on his sympathy with lies. A town meeting was called for noon. Men packed into the livery loft, shoulder to shoulder, the air thick with sweat and anger and fear and the smell of hay and horse manure. Voices rose in a cacophony of accusations and demands, each man trying to shout louder than his neighbor. Miles slammed his good fist on a barrel, the sound like a judge's gavel calling order. "This town can't breathe with that Indian stirring up trouble," he said, his voice carrying over the crowd, pitched to reach the back of the loft. "He's plotting something, working with the teacher and that saloon girl to bring raiders down on us. We've all heard the drums at night, seen the smoke signals on the hills. They're planning something big, something bloody, and we need to act before they do, before they murder us in our beds." Some men called for a posse to raid the Lakota camp, immediately burn it to the ground, and hang any man they found. Others worried about disrupting trade or provoking a war they could not win against a people who knew this land far better than they did, wanted proof, wanted evidence, wanted something more than fear and rumor. Bill offered a solution, his voice smooth as oiled leather, reasonable and calm. "We take the girl as witness," he said, spreading his hands as if offering a gift. "Keep the doctor under watch so he can't help them. Once she talks, and she will talk, pain makes people honest, the rest falls in line. Then we deal with the Indian and his conspirators legal-like. Fair trial, proper jury, fair hanging with a good rope, everything by the book." A vote was called. Hands went up across the loft. Not all hands, but enough. More than enough. That night, June 17th, just after sunset, painted the western sky in shades of blood and gold. Miles and a dozen riders surrounded the clinic, their horses stamping and blowing in the cooling air. Abraham heard the horses before he saw them, the jingle of bridles and creak of leather carrying in the stillness. He moved to the door, his old service revolver, a Colt Army model from the war, its grip worn smooth by years of handling heavy in his hand. The weight was familiar, almost comforting. "What do you want?" he called through the closed door. "The girl." Miles called from the darkness, his voice friendly in a way that made Abraham's skin crawl with revulsion. "We have a warrant, signed by the town council, all legal and proper. Open up, Doc, or we come in. Your choice." "A warrant signed by who?" Abraham demanded, his finger resting on the trigger guard. "Bill Barrow." "That's not law. That's just greed with a seal on it." "Open the door, old man." Miles repeated, his voice hardening, losing the false friendliness. "Last chance. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Abraham barred the door with a heavy oak plank, the one he used when winter storms threatened to blow the door in. "She can't even stand, you fool. You drag her out of here, she dies before you get her to wherever you're taking her. You want her testimony, you'll have to wait until she can survive being moved." A rifle butt smashed through the window glass, spraying across the floor in a glittering cascade that caught the lamplight. Rose, lying on the cot, jerked awake with a gasp, her eyes wide with terror, the whites showing all around. "Last chance," Miles said again, and there was finality in his voice now. A shot cracked the sound impossibly loud. The bullet tore through the door frame inches from Abraham's head, missing him by the width of a hand. Wood splinters flew like shrapnel, one long, jagged piece, gouging a bloody line across his ribs on the left side. He stumbled back, hand pressed to his side, feeling the warm wetness of blood soaking through his shirt. Lakota, waiting in the alley, with the account book wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from rain, heard the shot and understood immediately what it meant. He had spent the day of June 17th hiding in the ravine north of town, with Celine planning, arguing, trying to figure out how to get to Goldwater alive. But he had known with the certainty of experience that they would come for Rose. He could not let them take her. Not alive. Not to face whatever Bill had planned, which would be far worse than a quick death. He rammed a wagon tongue, a thick pine shaft, designed to withstand the pull of a team through the clinic's rear wall, splintering the thin boards inward with a crash. Abraham spun, raising the revolver with shaking hands. "Easy," Lakota hissed, keeping his voice low. "It's me. We're leaving. Now. They're coming in the front, and there's a dozen of them. Then we go out the back, and we go fast." Together, working with desperate speed that came from knowing death was seconds away, they lifted Rose from the cot. She bit down on a leather strap Abraham shoved into her mouth, her face going white as bone, whiter than the sheet, so pale she looked already dead. Every movement sent shards of agony through her legs, pain so intense her vision went gray at the edges, the world narrowing to a tunnel. But she did not cry out, would not give them the satisfaction, would not let them hear her weakness. Celine appeared in the alley doorway, breathless and wild-eyed, clutching an old Sharp's carbine she barely knew how to load. "Wagon's ready. Hurry!" They moved Rose onto the wagon bed, piling blankets around her to cushion the jolts they knew were coming, the impacts that would drive bone against bone. Abraham snapped the reins over the mule's back. The animal, a stubborn Missouri beast named Ulysses, who had survived the war and 3 hard winters, bolted forward just as the front door splintered inward under the combined weight of men's shoulders, wood cracking and hinges tearing free. Riders poured out of the clinic seconds later, shouting, their voices raised in wordless fury. Shots rang out, the muzzle flashes bright in the darkness. A bullet punched through the wagon's side with a meaty thunk, showering splinters across Rose's legs. Another shattered the rear wheel's iron rim with a shower of sparks, sending the wagon lurching sideways with a grinding shriek of metal on metal that set teeth on edge. Lakota ran beside the wagon, his body between Rose and the shooters, using himself as a shield because he had nothing else to offer. A bullet grazed his left shoulder, the already injured one tearing fabric and skin and sending a fresh wave of blood flowing hot down his arm. He gritted his teeth and kept running his moccasins, pounding the dirt in rhythm with his hammering heart lungs burning. The wagon careened off the main road onto a rough track leading toward the abandoned Cold Creek No. 2 mine. A played-out shaft that had been shut down after a blasting powder explosion killed 3 men in the summer of 1856. The rear wheel wobbled dangerously, the broken rim grinding against the axle, with a sound like a dying animal, threatening to collapse entirely and send them all tumbling. Behind them, the posse thundered in pursuit, at least a dozen riders, maybe more, their voices rising in a wordless roar of bloodlust and righteous anger, convinced they were doing the Lord's work, hunting down criminals and traitors. They reached the mine just ahead of the riders, the wagon skidding to a halt in front of the sagging timber shed that served as the entrance. Abraham drove the crippled wagon inside the mule's sides, heaving like bellows, foam dripping from its mouth. Lakota and Celine dragged Rose into the main tunnel, her legs trailing uselessly behind her dead weight, her breath coming in short gasps that barely moved her chest. The tunnel smelled of damp earth and old explosions, and something else, decay maybe, or just the accumulated despair of men who had died here in darkness. They stacked old timbers and abandoned ore carts into a low barricade just inside the tunnel mouth, working frantically, knowing they had seconds at best. Outside, hoofbeats thundered to a halt in a confusion of dust and shouting. Men dismounted their boots, hitting the ground rifles gleaming dull in the pre-dawn light that was just beginning to creep over the eastern hills, like a reluctant witness. Miles's voice echoed across the clearing, bouncing off the hills. "Send the Indian out and the rest walk free, you got my word on it. The word of a lawman." Bill, standing behind him in the growing light, muttered just loud enough for his voice to carry his tone conversational. "We bury all of them right here. Call it another mine accident. Happens all the time. Railroad don't care how we clear the claims, just that they get cleared. They'll pay same as always." Gunfire erupted, a rolling thunder of shots. Bullets slammed into the barricade with meaty thunks, kicking up splinters and rock chips, filling the air with dust and the acrid smell of gunpowder. The sound was deafening in the confined space, a continuous rolling thunder that made ears ring and teeth ache and thoughts scatter like startled birds. Inside, behind the barricade, Rose lay against the tunnel wall, her dress soaked with sweat despite the cool air, her breath ragged and painful. Lakota knelt beside her, one arm braced against the barricade to steady it against the impacts, the other hand resting near hers on the ground, not touching yet. Not quite, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of his skin through the cool air. She turned her head slowly to look at him, the movement taking enormous effort. His face was calm, intent, focused on the men outside, calculating angles and odds and possibilities. Blood seeped through his shirt from the bullet graze on his shoulder, the fabric dark and wet, but he did not seem to notice or care. "Why did you stay?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the gunfire, each word an effort. "In the yard. You could have walked away. You should have." He glanced at her, and for a moment something flickered in his eyes. Pain, maybe, or memory, or recognition of something he had thought lost forever. "Because you spoke when you didn't have to," he said, his voice steady despite the blood and the bullets and the certainty of death pressing in. "In that yard. You could have stayed silent, protected yourself. But you didn't. You told the truth. That takes more courage than fighting." "I was terrified," she admitted. "So was I," he said simply. "I still am. Terror and courage aren't opposites. They live together." That honesty hung between them, raw and unadorned, more intimate than any touch. A bullet ricocheted off the ore cart with a shower of sparks slamming into the wall, above Rose's head rock chips raining down. She flinched, but did not look away from his face, held his gaze like an anchor. The riders paused to reload the gunfire, dying to sporadic shots. In the brief lull, Lakota slipped deeper into the mine, moving by touch and memory and instinct, testing side tunnels with careful hands. He found a narrow passage that looped back toward the entrance. A ventilation shaft that emerged in a shadowed alcove about 8 feet above the main tunnel floor. A position any military man would recognize as tactically superior. He positioned himself there, the darkness wrapping around him like a familiar cloak, like the night wrapping around a hunter. His shoulder throbbed with each heartbeat, but he pushed the pain aside into a distant corner of his mind. Pain was just information. It could not stop him unless he let it, unless he gave it permission. When Miles led 6 men into the shaft, firing at the barricade with their carbines' muzzle flashes bright in the gloom, Lakota fired down from behind and above. His first shot, carefully aimed, caught one man in the thigh. The man screamed and went down hard, his rifle clattering away. His second shot ricocheted off a tin helmet, the spark bright, stunning another rider who stumbled and fell to his knees, dazed. The effect was immediate and chaotic, exactly what he had hoped for. Men cursed and stumbled, unsure where the shots were coming from, firing blindly in all directions. One dropped his rifle entirely and scrambled for the entrance on hands and knees. Another fired wildly upward, his bullets sparking off stone, the ricochet screaming past someone's head. A ricochet shattered a lantern one man was carrying, glass, exploding kerosene igniting in a brief flare, before dying, plunging the front of the mine into flickering half-light that favored the defender and disoriented the attackers. Miles retreated, stumbling over his own men, his face twisted with fury and something else, fear perhaps, or the dawning realization that this was not going as planned. Outside in the growing daylight, Bill's patience snapped like a dry branch under too much weight. "Bring up the blasting powder," he ordered, his voice sharp and final. "Now I want those barrels up here now." One of the riders, a young man barely 20, hesitated. He had hired on for $50 and the promise of easy work, not this. "Boss, what if it brings the whole hill down? We could..." "Then we get double pay for clearing the claim." Bill roared, spittle flying. "The railroad wants this land clear. They get it clear. I don't care if we bury them or blow them to hell. Move now." They brought up 2 oak barrels of blasting powder from the supply wagon, and the containers marked with red stencils warning of danger, black powder, coarse and granular. The mixture of saltpeter and sulfur and charcoal that had changed warfare forever. Each barrel held 20 pounds of explosive force. Bill personally supervised the placement, directing his men like a general positioning artillery. He was not foolish enough to step deeper into the shaft, not stupid enough to risk the ceiling coming down on his own head. He placed the barrels near the supporting timbers just inside the entrance, where the roof was already cracked from old stresses, visible fractures running through the rock like lightning frozen in stone. He lit the fuses himself, waxed hemp cords cut short, maybe 20 seconds each, no more, and pulled back to cover behind a massive boulder 50 yards away, his men following. "Fire in the hole," someone shouted the old miner's warning, and then the world ended. The explosion shook the earth, a sound so immense it was felt more than heard, a physical wave of pressure that drove the air from lungs and made hearts stutter. Inside the mine, the sound was apocalyptic, a roar that filled every space and drove all thought from minds. The ceiling groaned, a long, drawn-out sound, like a dying beast, like the earth itself screaming. Timbers cracked with reports like rifle shots, rapid fire, crack, crack, crack in quick succession. Then the roof came down. A rain of rock fell, first small stones, and dust pattering like hail. Then larger chunks, fist-sized, head-sized. Then entire sections of the ceiling gave way, collapsing in a thunderous avalanche that filled the tunnel mouth and choked off light and air and hope. Abraham was thrown against the wall. By the concussive force, his frail body lifted and hurled like a child's toy. His head struck stone with a sickening crack that echoed even through the roar of falling rock. He slid to the ground, slowly, almost gently, blood slick and dark on his temple pooling on the ground beneath him. His eyes rolled back, showing only whites. Rose was flung sideways by the blast wave, her body lifted and thrown. She hit the ground hard, and one of her splints snapped with a sound like a breaking stick, the wooden slat giving way. The jagged end drove into her calf, punching through skin and muscle. Pain exploded through her, white-hot and all-consuming, a vast ocean of agony that threatened to drag her under into blessed unconsciousness. She could not even scream, her throat locked, her lungs empty. Dust filled her mouth thick as mud, choking her, turning her spit to paste. Celine was knocked flat, the carbine flying from her hands to clatter against stone somewhere in the darkness. Her head rang like a bell vision, swimming with sparks and shadows. Lakota fought his way back through the settling debris, moving by feel and desperate determination, his lungs burning with each breath, every inhalation bringing more dust and smoke. The main tunnel was blocked almost entirely by fallen rock, a wall of stone and timber where the entrance had been. But a jagged opening remained high on the left side, barely visible through the dust, leading toward a ventilation shaft he remembered from hunting trips in these hills years ago, before the miners came, before everything changed, and the world became a smaller, meaner place. With every breath burning like fire in his chest, he found Celine first pulling her to her feet, shaking her until her eyes focused. "Can you move?" She nodded, coughing, unable to speak. He boosted her up toward the opening, first lacing his fingers to give her a step, lifting, despite the screaming protest from his injured shoulder. She climbed, coughing and gasping, her hands scrabbling for purchase on the rough stone, fingernails breaking, leaving smears of blood on the rock. Then he turned to Abraham. The old doctor was unconscious, his breathing shallow and wet, each breath rattling in his chest in a way that spoke of broken ribs and punctured lungs. Blood seeped from the gash on his scalp, matting his gray hair. Lakota lifted him as carefully as he could, cradling his head against his chest, to keep it from lolling, to preserve what dignity remained. Getting him through the narrow opening was like threading a needle in absolute darkness while the world shook itself apart. Lakota pushed from below his arms, shaking with effort. And Celine pulled from above both of them, grunting with exertion, and somehow, by luck or grace or sheer stubborn will, they got him to the other side of the collapse, into the ventilation shaft that angled upward toward daylight and air. Then came Rose, and Lakota knew with cold certainty that this would be the hardest thing he had ever done. Lifting her was nearly impossible. His left shoulder was half useless, now torn and bleeding, the muscles screaming in protest, with every movement tendons stretched past their breaking point. But he braced his back against one wall of the tunnel, locked his arms under her armpits in a grip that would leave bruises if they survived, and lifted with everything he had left. Rose's vision went white, then black, then white again, in pulsing waves. The pain was beyond anything she had words for, beyond description, a vast, drowning ocean of agony that pulled her under and held her there. She bit down on her lips so hard, blood filled her mouth, the coppery taste mixing with dust and desperation and the salt of her own tears. She wanted to scream, to beg him to stop, to let her die here in the dark, rather than endure another second of this torture. But she did not scream. She locked her jaw and endured because that was all that was left to her. All she had left to give endurance, survival, the stubborn refusal to quit. Inch by agonizing inch, Lakota pushed her upward toward the opening. His arms shook violently, muscles spasming. His shoulder felt like it was tearing apart from the inside ligaments, snapping one by one. He could feel the wetness of fresh blood soaking his shirt warm and slick, running down his ribs. Celine grabbed Rose's wrists from above and pulled with all her strength, her own arms trembling her injured shoulder, screaming. The rough stone scraped Rose's back and legs, tearing fabric and skin, leaving long, bloody trails. Rose did not care anymore, past caring about anything except the need to be out, to breathe, to not die in the choking darkness. When Rose finally came through, she collapsed into Celine's arms, both women gasping and sobbing. By the time Lakota dragged himself through the opening seconds later, his arms were shaking so badly he could barely grip the stone. His vision swam with black spots, exhaustion and blood loss taking their toll. The ventilation shaft angled upward at a steep pitch, narrow as a coffin barely wide enough for a man's shoulders to fit. They crawled on hands and knees, Abraham draped across Lakota's back. Like a corpse, Rose dragged between Celine and Lakota, all of them moving through darkness and dust and the lingering smell of blasting powder. The shaft spat them out onto a narrow ledge above a ravine, the sudden daylight blinding after the darkness, making them squint and shield their eyes. The path hugging the cliff face was barely 2 feet wide, crumbling at the edges, where winter frost and summer rain had eaten away the stone over years. The ravine dropped away to their right, 100 feet of empty air, ending in jagged rocks and the thin silver thread of Cold Creek far below, sparkling innocently in the morning sun. Below, spread out in the clearing around the mine entrance, Bill and his riders circled the hill like wolves, searching for another way to their prey, their horses stamping and blowing. Then one of them looked up and shouted, pointing at the ledge, and the air filled with the crack of rifle fire. The path was treacherous, barely wide enough for one person walking carefully, deadly for people stumbling with wounds and exhaustion. Rock crumbled at the edges under their boots and hands, pieces breaking off to fall into nothing, disappearing silently until they struck bottom far below. The ravine yawned to their right, a hungry mouth waiting to swallow them. One misstep would mean death, quick and certain. Celine fired the Sharp's carbine. She had somehow managed to keep the heavy rifle bucking against her shoulder. The recoil nearly knocked her off balance, her feet slipping on loose stone. She missed her target completely, the bullet kicking up dust near a rider's horse. The horse reared in panic, throwing its rider hard, the man hitting the ground with a thud that carried even up to the ledge. But 3 more men were already scrambling up the slope on foot carbines in hand. A bullet grazed Celine's upper arm, tearing through fabric and skin in a long red line that immediately began to bleed. She gasped, biting back a cry, but kept moving, her left hand pressed to the cliff face for balance, the rock rough and solid under her palm. Abraham, barely conscious, his eyes glassy and unfocused, stumbled forward on pure instinct, his body moving while his mind drifted elsewhere. Blood still seeped from the gash on his scalp, running down the side of his face, dripping from his jaw. Ahead, a rider scrambled up onto the path, blocking their way forward, a young man with a patchy beard and a knife in his hand, his face twisted with fear and determination. Abraham looked at the man, young enough to be his grandson, someone's hope for the future, and made his choice in the space between heartbeats. He thought of Thomas buried under rock. He thought of Rose broken, but surviving. He thought of all the deaths he had catalogued in silence, all the times he had stayed quiet when he should have spoken. Not this time. Not anymore. He lunged forward, not at the knife, but at the man's legs, wrapping his thin arms around them in a tackle that used the last of his strength. They both went over the edge together, tumbling down the rocky slope in a tangle of limbs, striking outcrops, and boulders breaking and breaking and breaking. The sound of their impact on the rocks below echoed up from the creek bed, sharp and final, then faded into the morning wind, leaving only silence. Celine screamed a raw sound of grief and rage torn from somewhere deep inside. "No, Abraham. Keep moving." Lakota shouted, his voice hoarse from dust and smoke. He grabbed her arm, pulling her forward. He chose honor it move. Bill charged up the path ahead, having circled around while they were distracted, a Bowie knife in one hand, his face red with exertion and fury. He was older than Lakota, but heavier his weight and advantage in close quarters where leverage and mass mattered more than speed or agility. He slashed wildly the blade, whistling through the air. Lakota ducked, but the blade caught his already injured left shoulder, opening it, further cutting deep. Blood sprayed in an arc that caught the sunlight, turning it momentarily red. Pain exploded through him, bright and vicious and impossible to ignore. But he pushed through it because stopping meant death. They grappled on the narrow path, each trying to force the other toward the drop, toward the nothing. Bill drove a knee into Lakota's ribs, low and hard. Bone cracked audibly. Lakota's breath exploded out of him in a choking gasp, stars exploding across his vision. His heel skidded on loose stones at the path's edge. The stones rattled over the edge, falling into empty air, falling and falling. For a heartbeat, he teetered on the edge of nothing weight, shifting the wrong way, center of balance, gone arms, windmilling uselessly. Nothing but air behind him and death below. Rose, propped against the cliff 20 feet behind them, where Celine had left her, saw him falling. She saw Bill's triumphant snarl, the expression of a man who has won and knows it. She saw the drop the rocks below the end of everything. Without thinking, because thinking would have stopped her, would have made her realize the impossibility, she dragged herself forward on her elbows, her broken legs trailing behind her like dead things. Every inch was agony beyond description. The broken bones ground against each other, tearing muscle and nerve. Blood soaked through her torn dress, leaving a dark trail on the stone behind her. She grabbed the broken splint still jutting from her left calf, the jagged wooden end sharp and splintered and slick with her own blood, and yanked it free with one convulsive pull. Pain whited out her vision entirely, the world disappearing into a blaze of white fire. But she kept moving, crawling forward on pure will, on something deeper than conscious thought. Bill was focused entirely on Lakota, driving him backward inch by inch toward the drop. Not watching the crippled woman behind him, not considering her a threat, because what threat could a broken woman pose? Rose swung the bloody splint low with all her remaining strength, with everything she had left, driving the sharp splintered end into the back of Bill's right ankle just above his boot, punching through the leather and into the tendon beneath. The wooden spike drove deep, severing the Achilles tendon, cutting through the cord that held muscle to bone. Bill's scream was high and terrible and inhuman, the sound of an animal caught in a trap. His foot twisted sideways at an impossible angle, the ankle collapsing under his full weight. He flailed, trying to catch himself arms, reaching for something that was not there. He slammed into Lakota, his weight and momentum carrying them both toward the edge. Lakota's hands shot out in desperation, fingers closing around a jutting rock outcrop, a rough piece of granite that cut into his palm. His shoulders screamed as it took his full weight, and Bill's the joint threatening to separate entirely. But he held on with everything he had. Bill, thrown completely off balance by his ruined ankle, windmilled past him, his fingers scrabbling at empty air at Odakota's shirt, catching nothing. He fell backward off the path, arms still reaching, mouth open in a scream that rose, and then suddenly cut off when he hit the first outcrop 30 feet down. His body bounced once, tumbling, and struck the rocks at the bottom with a wet sound that carried clearly in the morning air. Then silence, broken only by the distant sound of running water and the ragged breathing of survivors. Miles, seeing his employer's broken body far below, seeing the blood and the carnage and the utter failure of everything, threw down his revolver and ran, choosing cowardice over loyalty, choosing life over principle. His footsteps faded down the path, scrambling and sliding, and then he was gone, vanished like smoke, leaving only dust behind. The climb back down took hours that felt like years. Every movement was measured careful, the work of people who had gone past exhaustion into some realm beyond, where the body moved on pure will. Odakota, with Celine's help, fashioned a crude travois from pine branches stripped from small trees and strips of fabric torn from their own clothes, the cloth already stiff with blood and dirt. They lashed Rose to it as gently as they could, wrapping her broken legs with what remained of the blankets, though every adjustment made her whimper despite her best efforts to stay silent. They found Abraham at the bottom of the ravine, where he had fallen half submerged in Cold Creek, in the water running red around him for a few feet before the current carried it away. His eyes were open, staring up at the morning sky, seeing nothing. His chest did not rise. The water moved his hair gently, almost tenderly, like a mother's hand. Odakota waded into the creek and closed Abraham's eyes gently, his hand lingering on the old man's forehead, feeling the skin already cooling. "Thank you," he said quietly, the words inadequate, but all he had. "You were a good man. Better than most, better than this place deserved. He saved us." Celine said, her voice breaking, tears cutting tracks through the dust on her face. "He gave us time. He gave us everything." "Yes," Odakota said simply. "He did." They could not carry his body, not with Rose on the travois, and all of them wounded and exhausted past the point of collapse. They marked the spot with a cairn of stones pulled from the creek bed, each stone placed carefully with both hands, building it tall enough to be seen from a distance, a silent promise to return when they could, to give him proper burial. By the time they reached the outskirts of Powder Keg, the sun was climbing toward noon on June 18th, the heat already oppressive, promising another scorching day. Odakota's left shoulder had stopped bleeding, but the whole arm hung useless at his side, dead weight. Celine's wounded arm throbbed with each heartbeat, the bandage she had torn from her petticoat already soaked through with blood. Rose lay on the travois, her face the color of old paper. But her eyes were open and clear, fever-bright, but aware. The town froze as they walked down the main street. Odakota, dragging the travois behind him with his good arm, Celine limping beside him with the empty carbine, serving as a walking stick. It was the same pairing from the saloon yard 3 days and a lifetime ago, the Lakota warrior and the Saloon Maid. But everything had changed. The balance of power had shifted in ways both visible and invisible. Men gathered on the boardwalk in front of stores and saloons, silent, watching. Women appeared in doorways, hands pressed to their mouths, their eyes wide. Children stared with the brutal honesty of youth, seeing the blood, and understanding that something important had happened, something that would be talked about for years. In front of the small courthouse, just a single room with a judge's bench and a stove. Celine opened the account book with hands that still trembled slightly. The pages were stained with ink and blood and mud, but the numbers were still legible, still damning. Her voice was hoarse from smoke and screaming, but it carried in the stillness that had fallen over the street like a blanket. She did not speak of good and evil, of justice and revenge and moral righteousness. Those were abstracts, meaningless. She read concrete facts, She read dates and numbers and names. She read payments from the Transcontinental Spur Company payouts to specific riders on specific dates, costs listed for coffins after staged accidents. She read the names of men who had died on days Bill Barrow got richer, the correlation perfect and damning. June 10th, 1858. She read, her voice steady despite everything. Payment to H. Miles, $50. Payment to J. Rollins, $50. Payment to T. Webb, $50. Note beside entries. Prepare removal section B. June 12th, 1858, just 2 days later. Payment received from Transcontinental Spur Company, $300. Note, Section B, cleared obstruction removed, 1 casualty reported as Indian raid. Miners in the crowd began to count on their fingers, putting names they knew to the anonymous dates, recognizing patterns they had been too close to see before. Faces darkened with understanding and anger. Murmurs turned to shouts, voices rising in fury. One man stepped forward from the crowd, a grizzled prospector named Harris, whose hands were permanently stained black from ore dust. "My brother died last August," he said, his voice shaking with rage, held barely in check. "Cave-in, they said. Accident." But he'd complained to Bill about the scales being rigged just the week before. August 3rd. Celine flipped pages with steady hands, finding the date. August 3rd, 1857. Payment to H. Miles, $50. Payment to T. Webb, $50. Payment from TSC, $320. Note, Harris claim vacated accident, arranged timbers weakened as instructed. The murmur became a roar, angry voices layering over each other, men shouting demands and accusations. Several men started toward the Red Lantern, murder in their eyes. Then Celine turned to the oldest section of the book, her fingers finding the page she had marked mentally. The crowd quieted slightly, sensing something important coming. January 15th, 1855. She read, her voice cutting through the noise, clear and strong. Payment from Territorial Government, $800. Purpose listed as Volunteer Clearing Patrol, Lakota Valley Suppression State Authorized Action. List of riders paid follows. She paused, letting the silence stretch, then read the names slowly, distinctly. W. Barrow, H. Miles, J. Rollins, T. Webb, and 6 others. She looked up at the crowd, her dark eyes fierce and uncompromising. Horatio Miles. She said clearly, loudly enough for everyone to hear. Was paid by our government to kill Lakota families, including women and children. Then he was paid by Bill Barrow to kill miners and settlers. He's been killing for money for 3 years, maybe longer. And everyone who took Bill's money is guilty of murder for profit. A rider appeared at the edge of town, approaching slowly with both hands, raised high and empty, the universal sign of peaceful intent. It was Jack Rollins, one of Bill's regular crew, his face haggard and drawn, looking 10 years older than his actual age. He dismounted carefully and walked forward on foot, every movement deliberate and non-threatening. "It's true," he said, his voice carrying in the stunned silence. "All of it. Every word. I rode with Bill. I took his money. I did things." His voice broke, then steadied. "I did things I can't take back. Things that'll damn me. But I didn't sign up for what he became, what he was doing. Killing women and children in 55 for a state contract. Rigging mine collapses. Staging Indian raids we blamed on people who had nothing to do with it." He pulled a folded paper from inside his shirt, the paper wrinkled and stained. "I kept receipts. Copies of some of the payments notes Bill made. My own insurance in case he turned on me like he turned on everyone else eventually. It matches what she's got in that book." The crowd parted for him like water around a stone. He handed the paper to Celine. She unfolded it with careful fingers, scanned the contents. More names, more dates, more payments, all corroborating the account book, and nodded slowly. This is a federal crime. Rollins said, his voice stronger now, the words rehearsed. Railroad fraud, murder for hire, conspiracy to defraud the government. I'll testify to all of it. Federal court, territorial court, doesn't matter. I'll hang for my part, if that's what it takes. But Miles needs to hang first, and every man who took that money needs to answer for it. The federal marshal from Goldwater arrived on June 21st, 3 days after the confrontation at the mine, having received a telegram from the Army post requesting immediate assistance with a civil matter. He was a lean man in his 50s, with a gray beard trimmed military short and eyes like chipped ice, a former Texas Ranger named Fletcher, who had seen every kind of evil men could invent and was no longer surprised by any of it. Just tired. He listened to Celine's account in the courthouse, taking notes in a small, leather-bound book. He studied Abraham's collection of prescription slips, now blood-stained, but still legible, and Rollins' receipts. He flipped through the account book methodically, his expression never changing, reading every page, checking calculations mentally. "This is fraud," he said finally, his voice flat and professional, devoid of emotion. "Against the railroad, against the territorial government, and against the federal land office surveying under congressional authority. That makes it federal jurisdiction. My jurisdiction." "What about the murders?" Celine demanded, her voice sharp with frustration, unwilling to let him reduce this to paperwork. "What about the families, the children killed in 1855, the miners crushed in rigged collapses?" Fletcher looked at her with eyes that had seen too much, that had stopped expecting justice and settled for process. "Miss the Transcontinental Spur Company wants this thieving cleaned up and the men responsible punished. Not because they care about your souls or your morals or what's right. Because their reputation is damaged and they're losing money to fraud, and that matters to their stockholders back east. But," he tapped the book with one scarred finger, "but theft and murder tend to tangle together in legal proceedings. Hard to prosecute one without the other coming out. We'll issue warrants for Miles and any surviving riders we can identify from these records. Charges will include conspiracy to commit murder fraud against the United States government, destruction of federal property, and obstruction of territorial survey operations." It was not justice, not the kind that balanced scales or brought back the dead or healed what had been broken. But it was something, and in a hard land where law was negotiable and justice was rare, something was more than most people ever got. Fletcher did one more thing before he left Powder Keg to return to Goldwater and begin processing warrants. He issued a federal order designating Powder Keg a witness town under the protection and jurisdiction of the U.S. Marshal Service. Any threat, intimidation, or violence directed at Rose Keller, Celine Broussard, Lakota, or any other witness cooperating with the federal investigation would be treated as obstruction of justice and interference with a federal witness, prosecutable under territorial and federal statutes, carrying mandatory sentences. In a hard country where law was more suggestion than certainty, and violence was the common language that promise backed by federal authority, and the implicit threat of Army intervention if necessary was worth more than any speech about justice or morality. We're doing what was right. Horatio Miles was caught on June 25th, just 6 days after the mine confrontation, trying to cross into Kansas territory with a stolen horse and Bill's cash box. Fletcher's deputies, 2 hard-faced men who had tracked fugitives across 3 territories, brought him back to Goldwater in chains, his hands and feet shackled, his face bruised from resisting arrest, one eye swollen shut. He was tried in the Goldwater courthouse on July 12, 1858, a full territorial proceeding with a circuit judge brought in from Denver City. The trial lasted 4 days of testimony, evidence, and legal arguments. Celine testified for 6 hours, reading from the account book, explaining the patterns she had found. Rawlins testified for 3 hours, describing specific incidents, naming names, providing dates and locations. The account book itself was entered as Exhibit A, each page photographed by a traveling photographer using the new wet plate process, creating permanent records. The jury, 12 men miners and merchants, and 1 former Army officer, deliberated for 90 minutes. They returned a verdict of guilty on all counts: conspiracy to commit murder in the deaths of 17 named individuals, fraud against the United States government, in the amount of $4,300, accessory to murder in the 1855 Lakota Valley Massacre and destruction of Federal Survey property. The judge, a gray-haired man named Blackwood, who had seen the elephant in the Mexican War and had no patience for excuses, sentenced Miles to hang by the neck until dead sentence, to be carried out within 30 days as prescribed by territorial statute. On the morning of August 1858, they erected a gallows in the yard behind the Goldwater Courthouse, a simple structure of fresh-cut pine that smelled of sap and new wood. A crowd gathered, maybe 200 people, some who had traveled from Powder Keg, others who were just curious to see a man hang. Rose leaning heavily on the cane Abraham had carved before he died, the handle worn smooth now by her constant grip, shaped perfectly to fit her palm, stood in the crowd with Celine beside her. Lakota stood at her other side, his left arm in a sling that the post-surgeon had fashioned his shoulder, slowly healing, though it would never be quite right again. They watched as Miles was led up the steps, his hands bound behind him, a priest murmuring prayers beside him that Miles ignored. They watched as the noose was fitted around his neck, the knot positioned carefully behind his left ear. They watched as the hood was offered and refused. Miles's eyes found them in the crowd just before the end. For a moment, something flickered in his expression. Fear, maybe, or regret, or just the animal panic of a creature that knows death is coming and can do nothing to stop it. Then the trap dropped with a wooden thunk that sounded loud in the sudden silence. His body jerked, once violent and convulsive, then went still. The crowd stood silent, watching him twist slowly in the morning breeze, the rope creaking. Rose felt nothing. No satisfaction, no relief, no sense of closure, only a vast emptiness, where something had been a hollow space that his death did not fill. "Is it over?" she asked Lakota quietly, her voice barely audible over the murmur of the dispersing crowd. "No," he said, equally quiet, his voice sad and wise and ancient. "But it's something. Sometimes that's all we get." 6 months passed. December 1858 brought the first heavy snows to the high plains, blanketing Powder Keg in white that made everything look clean and new, hiding the dirt and blood and ugliness under a pristine surface that would melt come spring. Rose Keller walked with the cane. Abraham had carved her gait, uneven, one leg, dragging slightly with each step, but she walked. She stood straighter than she ever had while carrying whiskey trays at the Red Lantern, her spine straight, her shoulders back, meeting people's eyes instead of staring at the ground. With Celine's help and a small loan from the Territorial Office, official compensation for her testimony and suffering, approved by a committee in Denver City, and paid in gold coin, she had transformed the back room of the old schoolhouse into a boarding house and kitchen. It was modest, rough pine tables that wobbled on uneven legs, mismatched chairs collected from various sources, a cast-iron wood stove that smoked when the wind came from the west. Gingham curtains sewn from flour sacks that still bore faint traces of the mill's stamp. But it was hers. Her name was on the deed recorded in the Territorial Land Office. No one could take it from her. That knowledge settled into her bones like warmth, like the first good thing she had ever owned. Miners, too, broke, for the saloons ate there, paying what they could, sometimes coins, sometimes or samples, sometimes just promises to pay when their claims came in. Lakota families stopping in town on market days to trade furs and crafts, rested there paying in venison or tanned hides or beadwork when they had no coin. Children, both Lakota and settler, did their lessons at the long table in the front room, while Rose stirred pots on the stove, and Celine corrected their arithmetic on slates, teaching them to read and cipher and think. The Red Lantern stood empty, its doors boarded with rough planks, its windows broken by thrown stones, and never repaired. Dust gathered on the bar in thick layers. Bill's office remained locked, the bloodstain on the floor, a permanent shadow that seeped through no matter how many times someone scrubbed it. No one wanted to buy the building. Some structures, people whispered, remembered too much evil to ever be cleansed, were cursed or haunted or just wrong in ways that made the skin crawl. The well behind the saloon, once Bill's private leverage over the whole town, fell under a new agreement brokered by Marshal Fletcher with input from the Army and the railroad and representatives from Old Crow's band. It was not justice, not even close, but it was practical. The Army needed water for its horses and men, the railroad needed water for its steam engines and work crews, and both sides would tolerate Lakota and settlers drawing from it freely, as long as no one brought rifles close enough to cause an incident that would require official response. The railroad, deeply embarrassed by the fraud and terrified of congressional inquiry that might threaten their land grants and federal subsidies, renegotiated boundaries with the Lakota. Old Crow and the other chiefs gained a narrow corridor of hunting ground along Cold Creek. Not large, not their ancestral lands, but something. A place to hunt deer and elk. A place to gather without harassment. A place to breathe without constantly looking over their shoulders for soldiers or settlers with guns. It was not the valley Dakota had lost, would never replace what had been taken from him. That valley was still cattle range, the graves unmarked and forgotten grass growing over the stones he had piled. But it was something. A small space of possibility in a world that usually offered none. One afternoon in early December, as the first snow began to fall in fat, lazy flakes that caught the light and sparkled like diamonds, Old Crow brought Dakota a letter. It had come through the territorial post from Goldwater, forwarded by Marshal Fletcher's office, the paper water-stained and wrinkled from its journey. Dakota opened it with hands that had learned to be gentle again over the past months, working with Rose to chop vegetables and mend harnesses, and do the 1,000 small tasks that keeping a boarding house required. Inside was an official document, dry and legal, covered in stamps and seals and signatures, the language dense and formal. The account book ledgers cross-checked against the railroad's own records, and the territorial treasury and various federal offices had forced multiple entities to pay restitution for wrongful casualties and fraudulent claims arising from illegal activities in Powder Keg Township and surrounding territories. Most of the money, several $1,000s in total, would go to widows and orphans of dead miners distributed through a trust administered by the territorial court. Some would go to families forced off their land, compensation calculated at $5 per acre for improvements lost. A separate fund was established for medical expenses incurred by victims. But at the bottom of the distribution list was a line that made Dakota read it 3 times, his finger tracing the words to make sure they were real medical expenses and personal damages, Powder Keg Incident Estate, of Dr. Abraham Keller, deceased designated beneficiary, RAR. Keller, in care of Keller Boarding House, Powder Keg Township. The amount listed was $117.30. It was not a fortune, would not make anyone rich. But it would have taken Rose 2 years to earn that much hauling whiskey at the Red Lantern, 2 years of backbreaking labor and humiliation and constant fear. Below that was another line, one that made Dakota's throat tighten. Cultural damages and unlawful displacement arising from January 1855. Incident Lakota Band Cold Creek Valley designated Representative Old Crow payment in form of grazing rights restoration and material goods as negotiated under territorial treaty provisions. It was not enough. Could never be enough. No amount of money or land could bring back Winona or his daughter or the world that had existed before the volunteers came. But it was acknowledgement. Official recognition that wrong had been done, that lives had value, that his family had mattered. That was something. In a world that usually pretended Indians did not exist, or that their deaths did not count, official acknowledgement was almost revolutionary. Lakota folded the letter carefully, precisely, and walked to the boarding house, his moccasins crunching in the fresh snow. Rose was on the back porch, despite the cold, stirring a pot of beans seasoned with salt pork and wild onions, the smell rich and savory. She looked up when she heard his footsteps on the stairs, her face lighting with a smile that was still new enough to surprise him every time, to make something warm bloom in his chest. "You're early?" she said, her breath pluming in the cold air. "Supper's not ready for another hour at least." He handed her the letter without speaking. She wiped her hands on her apron flower sack fabric embroidered with simple flowers by Selena Gift, and took it, reading slowly, her lips moving over the unfamiliar legal phrases. When she reached the line about Abraham's estate, her hand went to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears that spilled over and ran down her cheeks. "Abraham," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Even now, even after everything, he's still taking care of me." She folded the paper carefully and tucked it into her apron pocket, her hand pressing against the fabric, as if she could feel his presence through the paper. For a moment, she stood silent, her head bowed, and Lakota understood she was praying or remembering, or both. Then she looked up at him, her eyes red but clear. He was a good man. "Yes," Lakota agreed. "One of the best I've known. He chose how to die, and he chose well." Lakota leaned against the porch post, close, but not touching his weight, resting on the weathered wood. His left arm was out of the sling now, mostly healed, though it would never have. Its full strength back would ache in cold weather and remind him of that day for the rest of his life. "You didn't have to stay," Rose said quietly, not looking at him, focused on stirring the pot, though it did not need stirring. "That night in the yard, when they pointed their guns and made their threats. You could have walked away. Should have. It would have been the smart thing, the safe thing. You didn't have to speak," he answered, his voice equally quiet. "You could have stayed silent when they asked why. Protected yourself. Let them think whatever they wanted to think." "I was terrified," she admitted, finally meeting his eyes. "I thought they'd kill me right there. Maybe thought they'd do worse first." "I know," he said. "I was afraid too. Still am most days. Fear doesn't make you weak. Acting despite fear, that's courage. That's what you did." She turned to face him, fully leaning her weight on the cane, her body tilted slightly toward him. "What are we doing?" "Lakota?" She asked the question, direct, needing an answer. "What is this?" He thought about that, taking his time because the answer mattered, and she deserved truth, not platitudes. He thought about Winona and his daughter, about the grief that would never fully leave, but had transformed over months from a raw wound into something bearable, a scar he would carry always. He thought about the moment in the mine when Rose had dragged herself forward with broken legs to save him, and how that act had cracked something open in his chest that he had thought sealed forever, had made him believe that maybe there could be something after loss, something beyond just surviving. "Living," he said finally, the word simple but carrying weight. "Not just surviving. Living. Together, if you want that." "I want that," she said, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "I'm afraid of it, but I want it." Out in the street, visible through the falling snow, children chased each other in the accumulating white, their shouts, high and bright voices, mixing Lakota and English and laughter that needed no translation. The wind smelled of wood smoke and coming winter, and the faint mineral tang of snow on stone, and underneath it, all the promise of something that might, with care and time and stubborn will, become peace. Or at least its distant cousin. Rose leaned closer, her shoulder brushing his chest, not quite an embrace, but more than distance. He shifted his weight slightly, his right arm lifting to rest lightly across her shoulders, careful not to press too hard, leaving her space to pull away if she wanted. She did not pull away. No vows were spoken, no promises of forever made. In a hard, practical West, where tomorrow was never guaranteed and the past was never truly gone, they both understood that grief and hope could exist in the same breath, that survival and living were different things entirely. That love, if that was what this was becoming, could grow in unlikely soil if tended carefully. They stood together on the creaking porch while snow fell softly around them, and the light faded toward evening, two scarred survivors, watching a town that had almost killed them, learn slowly, painfully, haltingly, how to be something better than it had been. It was not a happy ending, not the kind that resolved everything neatly or erased the past or promised a future without difficulty. But it was an honest ending, and in the West, in 1858, honesty was the rarest currency of all, more valuable than gold or silver or any promise written in official documents. The boarding house door opened behind them. Celine appeared, flour dusting her dark hair, a smile on her face. "Supper's about ready," she announced. "And we've got a full house tonight, 8 miners, 3 families, and Old Crow says he's bringing venison to trade for bread. Rose, you'll need to stretch that pot. I'll manage." Rose said, turning back to the stove, but her hand found Dakota's before she moved, squeezing once quick and firm, a promise without words. He squeezed back, then released her, stepping aside to let her work. He would chop more wood for the stove, fetch more water from the well, do whatever needed doing. That was what you did when you built a life with someone. Not grand gestures or dramatic declarations. Just the steady accumulation of small acts day after day, building something solid enough to last. As the evening darkness settled over Powder Keg and lamps bloomed in windows up and down the street, the boarding house filled with voices and the smell of cooking and the sounds of life continuing despite everything, because life always continued, stubborn and resilient and impossible to kill completely. And on the porch, briefly alone again before duty called them back inside, Rose and Dakota stood side by side in comfortable silence, watching snow fall and children play, and a world slowly, incrementally become something they could bear to live in. It was enough. For now it was enough.